Hello, this is Chapter 8 on labeling theory. You can see here from the picture, this is Hester Prynne um, from The Scarlet Letter, Daniel Hawthorne's book. It's considered one of the first classic piece of American literature. I read it in high school. It's kind of long and boring, honestly, but there's an interesting lesson to be learned from this. So, Miss Prynne is accused of the crime of adultery, and throughout the book, in her community, she has to what? She has to wear a scarlet A on her clothing so that people will know that she's an adulterer. All right? Well, this is a form of labeling. And what labeling theory is about is how we label deviants. Let's take a little bit about the sociological background of this theory. There's some terms in here we probably need to refresh ourselves with. One is the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've seen this. Sociologists aren't the only discipline to talk about this. Psychology does as well. It's a situation in which a false belief or prediction makes the false belief come true. What we mean by that is a self-fulfilling prophecy is if you treat someone as a bad person and continuously tell them they're a bad person, um, for some people, they will eventually take on the role. They'll start to believe you, and they'll start to believe that about themselves, and they'll take on the role of being a bad person and behave accordingly. Sociology, we also talk about the concept of status or statuses. So statuses are just positions you occupy in a society, and we all occupy multiple positions at once. There are two basic types we've learned about throughout our training, and that is the achieve status, those that you've earned. So, like you guys are all high school graduates. You graduated from high school. You're all college students. Those are achieved statuses, so things to be proud of. And then there are ascribed statuses. Those are that you inherit. Your race, your sex are two main primary ascribed statuses. And that we occupy these multiple positions simultaneously. So right now, you as a college student have a variety of status positions. You're a student at Baylor, that's one. You're a son or a daughter. You're a parent, maybe, probably not. I'm a parent. You're a friend, a Christian, or some other religious affiliation, an employee, you have your race, you have ethnicity, etc. These are all positions you may occupy at the same time. Each of those positions has a set of expectations. As a student, you're expected to come to class, take notes, read your assignments, etc. As a friend, you're expected to, provide comfort and encouragement to your other friends and support. Otherwise, you'll be labeled as what? Being a bad friend. You don't want that. And so we argue that with each status, there's a set of expectations and behavior patterns you're supposed to follow. Now, we also talk about this concept of a master status. And a master status is one of your statuses that dominates all the others. Okay, so in other contexts, we've talked about, so let's say, for example, if you had an obvious physical disability, if you were a quadriplegic, well, that would be a status that would dominate all others. People would see you probably first and foremost as a quadriplegic. Um, Oftentimes, race can be a master status. When people see your race, they just draw assumptions about you. That's a terrible thing to do, but it does happen. We've seen this past, when we talk about um, African Americans and their interactions with the police, that the police see a young black guy and they automatically think criminal. Okay, and that's wrong because not all young black guys are criminals, right? Well, in this chapter, we're going to talk about deviant and how once you're labeled a deviant, how that can become a master status and really shape the outcome of your life. Okay. Now, where does labeling theory come from? Labeling theory is a radical theory. It is a hyper-liberal reaction to the other criminological theories we talked about in chapters 5 and 6. So in the 1950s, this has its origin and they thought that we weren't making enough progress regarding race and criminal justice, and that we were sort of looking for explanations of criminal activity as being embedded in either the communities or the personalities of the people who were committing the crimes. What labeling theory is asking is, why are some acts defined as deviant or criminal and others not defined as deviant or criminal? It's a fair question. They're going to take an issue with Hershey's assumption. Remember, Hershey argues that we are sort of born with a natural tendency to be not evil, but to cheat and take the easy way out. And these theorists are going to argue that people aren't born naturally evil, but we have our criminal status forced upon us by the criminal justice system and by society in the way that they define the people in power define certain acts as criminal and other acts as non-criminal. They're going to argue that it's the social reaction to behavior that is more important than the behavior itself when it comes to identifying and labeling criminals in our society. So, some basic ideas about labeling theory. We focus on the reactions of other people and the effects of these reactions. This is what creates deviance. Once a person creates what's considered a deviant act, she or he becomes labeled. So they become labeled as a crook, for example, or a junkie if they take drugs, or a whore if they're arrested for prostitution, or adultery, or some other form of deviant act. They're then placed into outsider status as a deviant, and oftentimes segregated from society. In this case, we talk about it as being put in prison. They become outcast. Who then associate with whom? Well, with other outcasts. And then these outcasts form deviant subcultures. Social interactionists have brought in the concept of self when it comes to explaining this. Their argument is that deviance is relative, and therefore, it's relative to time and place. I'll give you some examples here in the next video. The acts in themselves aren't deviant. It's the definition of the acts as deviant. So we'll jump ahead a screen just so you have an example here. So today, smoking is deviant. Okay? You cannot smoke on a plane. If you smoke on a plane, they're going to probably arrest you when the plane lands. They may even force the plane to the ground to a nearby airport, and they have somebody come on board and arrest you if you start firing up cigarettes on a plane. It's an act of deviance. But when I first started flying in the 1970s, people smoked on planes. They had smoking sections on planes. You buy your ticket in the smoking or non-smoking section. And the seats on the planes had little tiny ashtrays on them. You just pop them up, put your cigarette out, put it back down. I've never been a smoker. I've never smoked on a plane. But I have been on a plane where people smoked. So historically, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, smoking on planes was not an act of deviance. Today, it's a total act of deviance, and in fact can get you arrested if you try to do this. The point is, deviance is socially constructed. So the definition of an act as deviant goes through a social process. Society decides which behaviors are deviant. So from 1920 to 1932 in the United States, drinking alcohol was illegal. It was during Prohibition. It was considered an act of deviance to do this. It had socially constructed alcohol as something that we should not be allowed to drink or sell to one another. Of course, people did it anyhow. But the point is, you could be arrested and put in jail for consuming alcohol in the 1920s. Deviance also involves a process of defining and enforcing boundaries. Okay, so you have to figure out what separates good behavior from bad behavior, and then you have to enforce boundaries. Like, you can't, if you do this, it's okay, but if you do that, it's not okay. You can smoke outside. You can smoke off campus. But if you smoke on campus at Baylor, that's an act of deviance. And how do we enforce that boundaries? Through rules, regulations, and sanctions. So if you try to smoke on a plane, they're going to have you arrested. If you are caught smoking in a non-smoking hotel room, you're going to get charged a $250 to $500 fine for doing that. If you get caught smoking on campus, we're not going to arrest you, but there's probably going to be a fine involved. And that's how we enforce the boundaries, through the legal system. Labeling separates the good from the bad, the whore from the chaste, the crook from the honest, and the witch from the faithful. Fine. Basic tenets of labeling. There are two types of deviance: as primary and secondary. Primary deviance typically involves it's the first deviant act. We've all committed it at some point in our lives. Typically it happens in school, where we just get a little rambunctious and we don't listen to our teachers, etc. We misbehave in class. We've all done it. And the vast majority of people respond quite quickly to the sanctions labeled, or the sanctions meted out by the teacher. She gets angry. When I was a kid, you got spanked. I don't think they spank children in school anymore. But we've all tested that boundary and quickly figured out we don't really want to do that, because this doesn't end well. But not every student does that. Some students are still going to push the envelope. For some individuals, they will continue to break the rules, and the form of deviance may escalate. They may go from starting out in early school, misbehaving in class, to a little bit later on in their school careers, cheating on tests, and then the reactions, the sanctions ratchet up. They'll be sent to a principal. Somebody may call the parents will get involved. They may then slip into more serious acts, start cutting school, and then there'll be a formal reaction, a suspension from school, for example. And what happens then? Okay, so what happens to the reputation of that kid? He is getting labeled as a bad kid at school. And once you get into suspension, you become a problem student. Let's say the student creates, and once they become problem students, maybe they create get involved in another act of deviance, that draws some sort of formal reaction. And suppose they're bringing drug paraphernalia to school, they might get caught and sent to alternative school. Kid is labeled as bad by the school and by the other students at the school, somebody to be avoided. And this self-fulfilling prophecy kicks in at some point. Okay, that kid who started off misbehaving in first or second grade, who is now escalated to being suspended and doing some other bad things by 9th or 10th grade, begins to think of himself as a bad kid, because he's been labeled as a bad kid by the school, and he starts to hang around with other bad kids. Let's say these bad kids get into a serious trouble. Say they steal a car one afternoon. This is the secondary act of deviation. The primary act is one that draws sanctions from important people, but that are not in the legal system. In other words, not the criminal justice system. It's the secondary deviant act that gets people from the criminal justice system involved. The story I'm telling you is one of a former friend of mine, a kid I grew up with. His first name is Danny. I won't give his last name. We grew up together in Charleston, South Carolina, and had been friends all the way up through 10th, 11th grade in high school. And that's because Danny dropped out of school somewhere in the early part of the 11th grade. And Danny lived down the street from me, and he was, good guy, played football together. He was fast, could catch. We just hung out all the time. But then at some point, he was always getting in trouble at school, but not serious stuff, just enough to get his parents involved and to keep the teachers aggravated at him. And it got to the point where in 8th grade, I didn't want to be in class with Danny because he would always try to get me in trouble with him. It was terrible. Somewhere between 8th and 9th grade, he'd gotten in trouble. He'd gotten suspended a couple times in 8th grade. he had been labeled as a bad kid. And we got to high school, he started hanging around other kids that, in fact, it got so bad, my parents were considering moving to another part of town so that I wouldn't hang around this guy anymore. And it's a sad thing because, they had known him for a very long time as well. So sometime in the early fall of our ninth grade year, Danny and two of his new friends stole uh, one of their parents' cars, and none of them had a driver's license, and it was a stick shift, and none of them knew how to drive a stick shift. And they took it out for a joyride, and because they didn't know how to drive a stick shift, or really didn't know how to drive a car, they got in a terrible wreck. And then they all jumped out of the car and ran, leaving the car. It was somebody's parents, one of their three's parents' car at the scene, and they all took off running. And needless to say, the police finally caught them. And they had to go to court, and they got a record, and they didn't spend time in juvie, but they had a criminal record for what they had done that would be expunged when they turned 18. And it was just downhill from there. And next thing I know, he had been arrested for something else. And sometime early in what was my junior year, he was probably still a sophomore or freshman at the time. He just quit. He just quit school. So anyhow, fast forward to 1987. I am in my first year PhD program at Louisiana State University. Go Tigers. And I came home for Christmas, and my mom's like, "Hey, I need you to do me a favor. I got to go to work, and I really need a new tire on my car." So, okay, I'm chill. I got 2 weeks off here. I'll take care of it, Mom. I'm going to work. So I took my mom's car up to Western Auto down the street from where we lived, and I'm sitting there in the waiting room, and I'm looking, and I'm like, dang, I kind of know that guy in the back who's changing tires looks familiar. Turns out it was my friend Danny from years ago, and yeah, I didn't know what to say. He's a kid that was my friend in third grade on. Been great friends in elementary and middle school. Had lots of fun together. Always doing stuff together. And by my 11th grade, he had dropped out of school, and he was now working changing tires, at Western Auto. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's honest work. But I am a PhD student, and we had nothing in common anymore. So we just kind of said hello. Hey, great to see you again. And that was this last time I've seen him. I don't know what's happened to him since. But my point is that he got labeled pretty early as a bad kid in school, and he was one of the ones for whom the self-fulfilling prophecy became his reality. And we grew up in the same neighborhood. He had two parents. He did not come from a broken home. He had a younger brother who never got in any trouble. But he got labeled early by the system as someone that was bad, and it is something that really affected him, and it led down a bad path for him. All right. So the secondary deviance occurs once a person is exiled from normal society for being a primary, in other words, because of the primary deviance action. Once you're labeled a criminal deviant, it's attached to a person. It's basically a life of crime gets to be set in motion, because once you're labeled a criminal deviant, once you have a criminal record, once you have a felony conviction, you have to report that when you apply for any jobs, when you apply for some loans, government programs, etc. It is a master status. It's one which people will see you as a convicted felon as only a convicted felon, regardless of how much you might have rehabilitated your life. And felons are shunned by society. And they're oftentimes forced to survive on illegal activity. That's why basically about half of people who get out of prison wind up back in prison, particularly half of men who get out of prison, because they're labeled as a criminal, and it's hard for them to integrate back into. It can be done, but it's very difficult to be integrated back into regular society. And it's really interesting because when you look at the career paths of criminals, that if you take even the most violent aggravated assault convictions, after about 5 years, the person is no longer more likely to commit an assault than any other random person of the same age. And why is that? It goes back to, well, most of us age out of criminal activity anyhow. Most criminals age out of criminal activity at some point. But once you're labeled as a felon, basically it can follow you for the rest of your life. Even if you get it expunged, people do these deep background checks nowadays, and they'll find it, and they'll say, well, you're no longer a felon, but you were, in your past, and it's a hard label to overcome. And so, back to the Scarlet Letter. That's what Hester Prynne. She got labeled as an adulterer. And in fact, the minister who got her pregnant, he didn't. He does eventually come back and kind of confess to his crime. She got stuck with it, raising the child by herself, ostracized by the village, living out basically in the woods. All right, let's stop there.